I can't stand that old man smell anymore. It's like he brings death into every room. Those whispered words from my daughter-in-law Jennifer hit me like a physical blow as I stood frozen outside the kitchen door, holding my evening medication and realizing I'd become nothing more than an unwelcome burden in my own son's house. But by midnight that same night, I was sitting at my desk rewriting a will that would remove $2 million from people who saw me as nothing more than an inconvenient old man who smelled like mortality. If you've ever discovered that people you love merely tolerate your existence, if you've ever realized that your presence is seen as a burden rather than a blessing, settle in close. Because this story is about the most expensive lesson in respect that money can teach, and how sometimes the people who underestimate you end up learning exactly what your worth was after it's too late to matter. And if you love stories about family betrayal, hidden wealth, and the sweet justice of consequences, hit that subscribe button for Grandpa's Diaries. Trust me, this one will make you think twice about how you treat the elderly people in your life. At 75 years old, I'd been living with my son Thomas and his family for 3 years, ever since my wife Ruth passed, and the big house felt too empty to bear alone. I thought I was contributing to the household, helping with Marcus's college fund, paying for groceries, maintaining the yard, and sharing the wisdom that comes from 7.5 decades of living. But apparently what I thought was family harmony was actually just polite tolerance of an old man who'd overstayed his welcome. The dinner party that night had been Jennifer's idea, hosting her book club friends for wine and sophisticated conversation about literature I'd never heard of and social issues I supposedly couldn't understand. I'd offered to stay in my room so they could have privacy, but Jennifer had insisted I join them, calling me Thomas's sweet father and encouraging me to share stories about my engineering career. I thought she was being inclusive. Now I realized she was performing kindness for her friend's benefit. The conversation had flowed pleasantly enough, with Jennifer's friends asking polite questions about my work on the Atlanta subway system and my memories of the civil rights era. I'd felt valued, heard, appreciated for my experiences and perspectives. When I excused myself to get my evening medications, I was smiling, thinking about how blessed I was to have a daughter-in-law who made me feel like part of the family, rather than a burden to be managed. But pausing outside the kitchen door to organize my pill bottles, I heard Jennifer's voice drop to that conspiratorial whisper women use when they think they're safely alone. Don't get me wrong, Harold's a sweet man, but living with an elderly person is so much harder than I expected. I can't stand that old man smell anymore, you know what I mean? It's like he brings death into every room, and I'm constantly worried Marcus will start associating our home with decline and decay. The medication bottles slipped from my hands, clattering on the hardwood floor like my heart was clattering against my ribs. I stood there listening to my daughter-in-law describe me as a source of death and decay, a burden she endured rather than a grandfather she cherished. Her friends murmured understanding responses about the challenges of caring for aging family members, and Jennifer continued painting me as an obligation she'd accepted reluctantly, rather than a person she'd welcomed lovingly. Walking back to my room that night, I realized that every kindness Jennifer had shown me, every inclusive gesture, every moment of apparent affection, had been performance designed to make herself look good, rather than genuine care for my well-being. The family I thought had embraced me had actually been tolerating me, and the daughter-in-law I'd grown to love had been counting the days until my old man smell would no longer contaminate her perfect home. Before that devastating night shattered my illusions about family love, I'd believed I was living my golden years surrounded by people who genuinely valued my presence and contribution to their lives. Thomas had been the one to suggest I move in after Ruth's funeral, presenting it as a mutually beneficial arrangement where I could help with household expenses, while they provided companionship and care as I aged. "Dad, this house is big enough for all of us, and Marcus needs his grandfather around," he'd said. And I'd felt grateful for a son who wanted to honor the family bonds Ruth and I had worked so hard to create. Ruth and I had raised Thomas to be a good man, teaching him the values of respect, hard work, and family loyalty that had carried us through 48 years of marriage. When he brought Jennifer home during his senior year of college, we'd welcomed her like the daughter we'd never had, supporting their relationship through graduate school and the early struggles of building careers. Jennifer had seemed to genuinely enjoy our company, asking Ruth for cooking advice and sitting with me on the porch discussing everything from politics to philosophy. The early months of living with Thomas's family had felt like a beautiful extension of the close relationships we'd always maintained. I'd wake up early to make coffee and read the paper before anyone else stirred, then help Marcus with his homework when he got home from school. Jennifer would often join me in the kitchen while preparing dinner, asking about my day and sharing stories about her work as a pediatric nurse. We'd developed what I thought were genuine bonds built on mutual respect and affection. Marcus, my 16-year-old grandson, had been the brightest light in those years after Ruth's death. We'd spend hours talking about his dreams of studying engineering like his grandfather, working on science projects together, and discussing the challenges of growing up in a world so different from the one where I'd come of age. I'd been contributing significantly to his college fund, proud to help secure educational opportunities that would honor the sacrifices Ruth and I had made for our family's future. My financial contributions to the household went far beyond what Thomas and Jennifer realized. While they knew I helped with groceries and utilities, they had no idea about the trust fund I'd established, the life insurance policies that would mature, or the investment portfolio I'd built during my engineering career. Ruth and I had lived modestly, saving and investing carefully so our family would be financially secure for generations. The monthly checks I gave Thomas represented only a fraction of wealth they couldn't have imagined. Jennifer's treatment of me during those 3 years had seemed genuinely warm and caring. She'd ask about my doctor appointments, bring me books she thought I'd enjoy, and include me in family decisions about vacations and holiday celebrations. When I'd mentioned feeling useless sometimes, she'd reassured me that my presence made their house feel like a real home, rather than just a place where busy people slept between work obligations. I'd believed every word because I wanted to believe my family needed me as much as I needed them. The social dynamic in their home had felt comfortable and natural, with Jennifer often praising my contributions to her friends and describing me as a blessing rather than a burden. "We're so lucky to have Harold living with us," she'd tell neighbors. "He brings such wisdom and stability to our household, and Marcus adores having his grandfather around every day." I'd overhear these conversations and feel proud that my daughter-in-law appreciated having me as part of her family structure. But that night outside the kitchen, listening to Jennifer's true feelings about my old man smell and the death I supposedly brought into her perfect home, I realized that every kind word had been calculated performance designed to maintain family harmony, while she privately resented my presence. The woman I'd grown to love as a daughter had been tolerating me as an obligation, counting the days until my inevitable departure would free her from the burden of pretending to care about an elderly man who'd outlived his usefulness. Looking back after that devastating night, I began recognizing signs I'd missed or dismissed as minor quirks in Jennifer's behavior. The way she'd quietly open windows after I'd been sitting in the living room, claiming she needed fresh air, while making sure I noticed her efforts to improve the room's atmosphere. The subtle redirections when I'd offer to help with cooking, suggesting I might be more comfortable watching television while she handled kitchen duties that apparently required younger, less contaminated hands. There had been the gradual changes in seating arrangements during family gatherings, with Jennifer always managing to position me at the far end of tables or in chairs slightly separated from the main conversation flow. She'd present these arrangements as consideration for my comfort. "Harold, you'll have more room to stretch your legs over here." But I now understood they were actually strategies to minimize my presence in the social dynamics she was trying to create. The gift-giving patterns during holidays should have revealed her true feelings months earlier. While Thomas and Marcus received thoughtful, personal presents that reflected their interests and personalities, my gifts were always practical items designed to contain or minimize the impact of my presence. Air fresheners for my room, upgraded bathroom fans, expensive soaps and colognes presented as luxury items, but clearly intended to address the old man smell that apparently offended her so deeply. Jennifer's conversations with her friends had been filled with coded language I'd misinterpreted as affection, but now recognized as subtle complaints about the challenges of elderly caregiving. "Harold keeps us on our toes," she'd say with a smile that I thought was loving but was actually expressing frustration. "He's always got stories to tell," she'd add in a tone I'd mistaken for appreciation but was actually indicating her exhaustion with listening to an old man's memories. The household cleaning schedules had subtly shifted to accommodate what I now understood was Jennifer's perception of my contaminating presence. She'd developed elaborate routines for disinfecting surfaces after I'd used them, always explained as general hygiene practices, but actually designed to eliminate traces of my occupancy. The laundry systems that kept my clothes separate from family items weren't about fabric care. They were about avoiding contact with garments that carried my allegedly offensive odor. Medical appointments had become sources of tension in ways I'd attributed to Jennifer's professional concern as a nurse, but I now realized were actually expressions of her anxiety about my continuing presence in her home. When doctors gave positive reports about my health and longevity prospects, Jennifer's responses weren't relief. They were barely concealed disappointment about the extended timeline of her caregiving obligations. The most painful realization was understanding how Jennifer had been coaching Marcus to maintain polite distance from his grandfather without the teenager recognizing the manipulation. Suggestions that he might prefer studying in his room rather than at the kitchen table where I often sat reading. Redirections away from activities that involved extended physical proximity to his allegedly malodorous grandfather. Subtle discouragement of the close grandfather-grandson relationship that I'd treasured as one of life's greatest blessings. Even our apparent bonding moments had been contaminated by Jennifer's underlying resentment and disgust. The kitchen conversations I'd cherished as daughter-in-law and father-in-law growing closer were actually endurance tests she'd forced herself through while mentally calculating how long she'd have to tolerate my presence before natural mortality solved her problem. Every smile had been performance. Every inclusive gesture had been obligation, and every expression of care had been carefully constructed theater designed to maintain family peace while she privately counted the days until my old man smell would no longer pollute her perfect home. Sitting in my room that night after overhearing Jennifer's cruel words, I felt something die inside me that had nothing to do with age or illness. It was the death of trust. The end of believing that family love could transcend inconvenience and discomfort. But as the hurt settled into my bones, it transformed into something harder and more purposeful. The determination to ensure that people who saw me as nothing more than a smelly burden would discover exactly what their callousness had cost them. Sleep was impossible after learning how my daughter-in-law really felt about my presence in her home. I lay in the dark listening to the house settle around me, wondering how many other conversations had taken place where Jennifer expressed her disgust with my proximity to her perfect life. Every kind word she'd spoken to me now felt like an elaborate lie. Every gesture of inclusion now seemed like calculated performance designed to maintain family harmony, while she privately resented my continued existence. The will that had made Thomas and Jennifer my primary beneficiaries sat in my desk drawer, a document that would have transformed their comfortable middle-class life into genuine wealth after my passing. $2 million in investments, life insurance policies, and the family home that was worth far more than they realized, all designated for people who apparently spent their private moments discussing how much they couldn't stand sharing air with an old man who smelled like mortality. Margaret Williams, my attorney and friend for 20 years, had always kept late hours during her practicing days, and I knew she'd still be awake at 11 p.m. working on cases or reading legal journals. When I called her that night, my voice was steady despite the emotional earthquake that had shattered my assumptions about family love. "Margaret, I need to see you first thing tomorrow morning. I'm rewriting my will, and I want to make sure the people who deserve my legacy are the ones who receive it." Margaret's questions were gentle but probing, designed to ensure I was making decisions based on clear thinking rather than temporary emotional upheaval. When I explained what I'd overheard, her professional demeanor cracked slightly. "Harold, in 40 years of practicing law, I've seen plenty of families torn apart by greed and selfishness. But this level of disrespect for an elderly family member is particularly cruel. Are you certain about what you heard?" Her validation of my hurt helped solidify my resolve. The new will I outlined to Margaret that night reflected not just anger about Jennifer's cruelty, but a thoughtful reconsideration of who in my life had shown genuine care and respect for my dignity as a human being. Sophia Martinez, my neighbor who checked on me daily and genuinely enjoyed our conversations about gardening and grandchildren. Dr. Patricia Chen, who treated me like a valued patient rather than a medical inconvenience. The scholarship fund for engineering students that would honor Ruth's memory, while helping young people who reminded me of my younger, more hopeful self. Thomas would still receive something, not because he deserved my wealth, but because he was my son and hadn't actively participated in Jennifer's cruel assessment of my worth. but the bulk of my estate would go to people and organizations that had treated me with dignity rather than tolerance, respect rather than resentment, love rather than obligation. Jennifer would get exactly what she thought I was worth. Nothing but the memory of an old man who'd smelled like death and inconvenience. By 3 a.m, I had a clear plan for redistributing wealth that Jennifer and Thomas never knew existed. The irony was perfect. The woman who couldn't stand my old man smell would spend the rest of her life wondering what financial security might have smelled like if she'd treated me with basic human decency. The family that saw me as a burden would discover too late that they'd discarded a blessing worth more than they could have imagined. The morning after rewriting my will, I began the process of quietly extracting myself from a household where I'd never again feel welcome or valued. But rather than retreat into isolation and bitterness, I decided to invest my remaining years in relationships with people who saw value in an elderly man's presence, rather than burden in his proximity. The first step was accepting Sofia Martinez's long-standing invitation to join her weekly coffee group at the community center, where I discovered a world of people my age who treated each other with dignity and genuine affection. Sofia's circle included retired teachers, nurses, mechanics, and business owners who gathered every Wednesday morning to discuss current events, share stories about grandchildren, and support each other through the challenges of aging with grace and purpose. Unlike the polite tolerance I'd experienced at Jennifer's dinner parties, these conversations were filled with genuine interest in each person's experiences and perspectives. When I mentioned my engineering background, they asked detailed questions about my work on Atlanta's infrastructure, treating my knowledge as valuable rather than outdated. Dr. Patricia Chen became not just my physician, but a genuine friend who appreciated the questions I asked about my health conditions and the research I'd done about age-related medical issues. During appointments, she'd often extend our conversations beyond medical necessities, discussing her own challenges as a first-generation immigrant physician and seeking my perspective on social changes I'd witnessed during my 7 decades in Atlanta. Our relationship felt reciprocal rather than purely transactional. The neighborhood where Thomas and Jennifer lived suddenly revealed pockets of community I'd never noticed during my 3 years of focusing primarily on family relationships. Mrs. Rodriguez, 2 houses down, had been caring for her elderly mother with Alzheimer's and welcomed my offer to sit with the older woman while she ran errands. Mr. Williams across the street was a retired history professor who invited me to join his book club, focused on African American literature and civil rights memoirs. These connections fed my soul in ways I hadn't realized were lacking. Volunteering at the Boys and Girls Club brought me into contact with teenagers who reminded me of my own youth, full of questions about life, career choices, and navigating relationships with family members who didn't always understand their dreams. My engineering background proved valuable in helping them with science projects and understanding mathematical concepts. But more importantly, they seemed to genuinely enjoy spending time with someone who listened to their concerns without judgment or condescension. The scholarship committee work that became part of my new will allowed me to meet young people pursuing engineering degrees despite financial obstacles similar to what I'd faced in the 1960s. Working with these students reminded me that my knowledge and experience had value beyond just family relationships, and their gratitude for mentorship opportunities contrasted sharply with Jennifer's view of my presence as contaminating and burdensome. Margaret Williams introduced me to her church's senior ministry, where elderly members provided support and companionship for each other while contributing to community service projects. The group's activities ranged from preparing meals for homeless shelters to tutoring elementary school students, giving me opportunities to feel useful and valued in ways that had been missing from my daily life in Thomas's household. These new relationships revealed how much I'd been diminishing myself to fit into Jennifer's vision of appropriate elderly behavior. Instead of sharing stories about my professional achievements or offering insights based on decades of life experience, I'd been minimizing my presence to avoid triggering her resentment about having an old man underfoot. But in these new contexts, my age was treated as a source of wisdom rather than evidence of decline, and my presence was welcomed rather than tolerated. 6 months after overhearing Jennifer's cruel assessment of my worth, I was sitting in my new apartment at the senior living community I'd chosen, not because I needed assistance, but because I wanted to live among people who appreciated rather than tolerated elderly presence. The irony wasn't lost on me that Jennifer had been encouraging this move for months, believing she was finally getting rid of her smelly burden. when actually she was helping me escape a toxic environment while unknowingly forfeiting a fortune she never knew existed. Thomas had seemed genuinely confused by my decision to move out, asking repeatedly if he'd done something wrong or if I was unhappy with their family arrangement. His concern appeared authentic, suggesting he'd been unaware of Jennifer's true feelings about my presence in their home. When I told him I simply wanted more independence and social opportunities with people my own age, he accepted my explanation while clearly feeling guilty about failing to provide adequately for his father's needs. Jennifer's reaction to my departure revealed the truth about her feelings more clearly than any overheard conversation could have. Her relief was palpable and barely concealed behind expressions of concern about my well-being and ability to manage independently. She insisted on helping me pack, clearly eager to ensure my complete removal from her space, while making comments about how this will be so much better for everyone, and how she hoped I'd find real happiness in my new environment. The apartment I'd chosen was actually more luxurious than Thomas's house, with better amenities and a community full of active, engaged people who treated aging as an adventure rather than a burden. My neighbors included retired professors, business executives, artists, and professionals who'd built interesting lives and had fascinating stories to share. The environment felt vibrant and intellectually stimulating in ways that contrasted sharply with the polite tolerance I'd experienced in my son's household. Margaret Williams visited regularly to discuss estate planning adjustments and became a trusted confidant as I navigated this new chapter of my life. She'd met Jennifer several times during family gatherings and admitted she'd never felt comfortable with my daughter-in-law's apparent sweetness, sensing something artificial in her interactions with me. "Harold, I've watched that woman perform kindness rather than feel it," Margaret observed. "Moving out was the best decision you could have made for your emotional well-being." Dr. Chen's assessment of my health improvement since leaving Thomas's house provided objective validation of what I'd felt subjectively. My blood pressure had decreased, my sleep quality had improved, and my overall mood was significantly better. "Living with people who appreciate your presence rather than tolerate it has measurable health benefits," she explained. "You're thriving in ways that suggest your previous living situation was more stressful than you realized." The new will I'd finalized gave me peace in ways I hadn't expected. Knowing that my wealth would support Sophia's grandchildren's education, fund Dr. Chen's clinic's community health programs, and provide scholarships for engineering students felt infinitely more satisfying than leaving money to people who saw me as a burden. Jennifer would never know what she'd lost by treating me with disgust rather than dignity, but I'd sleep better knowing my legacy would benefit people who understood the value of treating elderly individuals with respect. Marcus visited occasionally, and during one conversation he inadvertently revealed the household dynamics I'd suspected. "Mom's been in such a better mood since you moved out, Grandpa," he said innocently. "She says the house feels more like home now." His words confirmed what I'd known but hadn't wanted to fully acknowledge. My presence had been a source of tension that Jennifer had hidden behind performed kindness, while privately resenting my contamination of her perfect domestic space. 2 years after moving out of Thomas's house, I was hosting my monthly dinner party for 12 friends at my apartment's elegant dining room, surrounded by people who genuinely enjoyed my company and treated my presence as a gift rather than an obligation. The contrast with Jennifer's book club gatherings couldn't have been more stark. These conversations flowed with authentic interest in each person's experiences, and nobody was performing kindness while privately counting the minutes until the evening ended. Sophia Martinez had become like a sister to me, our friendship deepening as we supported each other through the normal challenges of aging, while celebrating the unexpected joys of finding genuine community in our 70s. When her grandson graduated from college using scholarship money I'd quietly provided, her tears of gratitude reminded me why redirecting my estate away from people who didn't value me had been the right decision. "Harold, you've been more family to us than some of our actual relatives," she told me, and her words felt more genuine than anything Jennifer had ever said. Thomas visited monthly, still clearly puzzled by my transformation from dependent father to socially active community leader. He'd walk through my apartment, noting the artwork I'd purchased, the dinner party preparations, and the calendar full of volunteer commitments, seeming to struggle with understanding how I'd built such a fulfilling life outside his household. "Dad, you seem really happy here," he'd say. And I'd nod while thinking about how happiness had been impossible in an environment where I was merely tolerated. Jennifer occasionally accompanied Thomas on visits, and her discomfort in my new environment was obvious and satisfying. She'd comment on how fancy my apartment was, clearly wondering how I could afford such luxury on a Social Security income, having no idea about the investment portfolio I'd never mentioned. Her interactions with my friends were stilted and awkward, revealing her inability to relate to elderly people who weren't ashamed of their age or apologetic for their continued existence. Dr. Chen had become not just my physician, but a close friend, who included me in her family celebrations and sought my advice about raising her own teenagers. When I told her about establishing a fund to support her clinic's community outreach programs, she insisted the contribution be anonymous because she didn't want our friendship to feel transactional. "Harold, you've enriched my life just by being in it," she said. "Your friendship is worth more than any financial contribution could ever be." The engineering scholarship recipients had become another source of joy. Their thank you letters filled with genuine appreciation for opportunities they wouldn't have had otherwise. Several graduates stayed in touch, updating me about their careers and families, treating me like an honorary grandfather who'd helped make their dreams possible. Their respect for my professional achievements and life experience provided the validation that had been missing during my years of being treated like a burden. Margaret Williams helped me establish a foundation that would continue supporting causes I cared about long after my passing, ensuring that my wealth would benefit people and organizations that shared my values about treating elderly individuals with dignity and respect. "Harold, this legacy will do more good than any inheritance to people who didn't appreciate what they had," she observed. "You've turned Jennifer's cruelty into something beautiful." The final irony came when Marcus, now 18 and heading to college, asked me directly about inheritance planning during one of our private conversations. "Grandpa, Mom's been wondering about your will and whether you've made provisions for Dad and our family's future," he said awkwardly. I looked at my grandson, a good kid who'd been influenced by his mother's attitudes but wasn't fundamentally cruel, and told him that people who appreciate what they have tend to be provided for, while people who take things for granted often discover what they've lost only after it's gone. Have you ever discovered that people you loved were just tolerating your presence? Have you found the courage to build new relationships with people who value you for who you are, rather than what you can provide? Share your story about finding genuine community after experiencing rejection. I'd love to hear how you've created meaningful connections later in life. And don't forget to subscribe to Grandpa's Diaries for more tales about dignity, respect, and the unexpected joy of discovering that sometimes the best chapters of life begin when you stop accepting less than you deserve.